Danny Cole had been flying through space for 3 months without finding anything valuable, and his bank account was getting emptier by the day, and the people he owed money to were sending messages that made his hands shake when he read them, because they talked about breaking bones and throwing bodies out of airlocks, and Danny knew they were not joking around. The salvage business was supposed to be easy money, but nobody told him that all the good wrecks were already picked clean, and what was left were rocks and dust and broken satellites that were worth less than the fuel it took to reach them. And Danny was starting to think he should have stayed on Earth and worked in his uncle's repair shop. But it was too late now because he had debts and no way to pay them. His ship was called the Rusty Bird, and it was a piece of junk that barely held together. But it was his piece of junk, and he knew every broken panel and every loose wire and every weird noise the engines made when they were about to die. And right now the engines were making a noise that sounded like a sick cat. And Danny was pretty sure that meant something expensive was about to break. He was floating through an asteroid field near the outer rim when his scanner made a sound it had never made before, and Danny sat up so fast he hit his head on the low ceiling and swore loudly because that hurt. But he forgot about the pain when he saw what was on his screen, because there was something big out there and it was giving off a power signature that made no sense. Danny changed course and pushed his engines harder than he should have, and the Rusty Bird complained with every bolt and rivet. But she kept going, and 20 minutes later Danny was staring at something that made him forget how to breathe, because floating in the darkness of space was a ship that looked like it had been grown instead of built. The hull was silver, and it seemed to glow with its own light, and there were curves and angles that hurt his eyes when he looked at them too long, and carved into the metal were symbols that looked like they were moving. Even though Danny knew that was impossible, and he had salvaged hundreds of ships, but he had never seen anything like this. Danny suited up and grabbed his tools and crossed the empty space between his ship and the strange vessel, and his heart was pounding because this could be the score that saved his life and paid off all his debts, and maybe even let him buy a ship that did not smell like old socks and mold. The airlock opened without him having to cut through it, and that should have been a warning. But Danny was thinking about money and safety and a future that did not involve running from angry criminals, so he went inside and sealed the door behind him. The interior of the ship was like nothing Danny had ever seen, and the walls seemed to pulse with soft light, and the air felt different, like it was alive somehow. And there were more of those strange symbols everywhere, and when Danny tried to take pictures with his helmet camera, the images came out blurry and wrong. He walked deeper into the ship, and his boots made no sound on the floor, and everything was too quiet and too still. And Danny started to feel like he was being watched, but every time he turned around, there was nothing there, and he told himself he was being stupid and kept moving forward. The corridors seemed to go on forever, and Danny was starting to think about turning back when he heard a sound that made his blood run cold, because it was the sound of a child crying. And Danny froze, because what was a kid doing on a derelict ship in the middle of nowhere? He followed the sound, and it led him to a massive room that looked like a throne room from an old story. And sitting on the floor in front of a huge chair was a little girl, and she was tiny and fragile looking, and she had pointed ears and silver hair that floated around her head like she was underwater. Curled around the girl were two creatures that Danny recognized from old Earth legends, because they looked exactly like dragons, except they were real, and they were breathing smoke, and their eyes glowed red in the dim light, and they were each the size of a large dog, and when they saw Danny, they hissed and showed teeth that looked very sharp. Danny raised his hand slowly and said, "Hey there, I am not going to hurt anyone. I just want to help." And his voice sounded too loud in the quiet room, and the little girl looked up at him with eyes that were silver like her hair and too old for her young face. She said something in a language that sounded like music and wind chimes, and Danny did not understand a word. But then she reached up and touched her own forehead, and suddenly Danny could hear her words in his head and understand them perfectly. The girl said, "The bad people came and they killed everyone, and Mama told me to hide here with Ash and Ember, and she said someone good would come and find me, but I have been alone for so long and I am scared." And Danny felt his heart break because he knew what it was like to be alone and scared. He knelt down slowly so he would not scare the dragons and said, "My name is Danny, and I promise I will help you, and what is your name?" And the girl looked at him like she was looking into his soul. And then she smiled, and it was like the sun coming up after a long, dark night. She said, "My name is Maya, and I am supposed to be queen now, but I do not know how to be queen because I am only 7, And these are my friends Ash and Ember, and they are dragons, and they protect me, but they are still young too. And Danny looked at the dragons that had teeth bigger than his fingers and thought, young, right, sure. Maya stood up, and Danny could see she was wearing a dress that looked like it was made of starlight, and there was a crown on her head that was way too big for her and kept slipping down over her eyes, and she said, Mama said I have to be brave, but I do not feel brave. I just feel alone. Danny had no idea what to do with a scared alien child who was apparently royalty, but before he could say anything, the whole ship shuddered and alarms started going off and red lights began flashing, and Danny knew that sound because he had heard it before when pirates showed up to steal his salvage. He grabbed Maya's hand and said, we have to go right now. And Maya looked scared, but she nodded, and the dragons spread their wings and followed as Danny ran back through the corridors, pulling Maya behind him. And the little girl kept up, even though her legs were much shorter than his. They reached the airlock, and Danny could see through the window that there were 3 ships surrounding the Rusty Bird, and they had weapons charging. And Danny swore because he knew those ships, and they belonged to the Krell, who were the meanest pirates in this part of space. Danny got Maya and the dragons into his ship and sealed the airlock and ran to the cockpit and started the engines, and the Rusty Bird groaned and shook, but she started moving, and Danny punched the controls, and they shot forward. Just as the Krell ships opened fire, laser blasts hit the shields, and Maya screamed and grabbed onto Danny's arm, and the dragons roared and breathed fire, even though there was nothing to burn, and Danny was flying the ship with one hand while trying to comfort a terrified child with the other, and he thought, this is how I die. But then Maya started singing, and it was the most beautiful sound Danny had ever heard, and the dragons began to glow, and they got bigger right before his eyes, and they breathed fire that was hotter than anything Danny had ever seen, and the fire somehow went through the hull without damaging it and hit the Krell ships. The pirate vessels just came apart like they were made of paper, and Danny stared in shock as pieces of metal and debris floated past his window, and then he looked at Maya, who was now slumped against his chair looking exhausted, and he said, what are you? Kid Maya looked up at him with those 2 old eyes and said, I am the last of my people, and you saved me. So now I will keep you safe, like you keep me safe. And Danny wanted to argue, but then she yawned and curled up in the co-pilot seat and said, thank you, Papa, and fell asleep. Danny sat there with his mouth open because this tiny alien girl had just called him Papa, and his brain could not process what was happening, and the dragons were now back to normal size and curled up around Maya like living blankets. And one of them looked at Danny and made a sound that was almost like a purr. He set course for the nearest station and looked at Maya, sleeping peacefully with her 2 big crown crooked on her head, and he thought, what have I gotten myself into? 3 days had passed since Danny found Maya, and his life had become completely insane because now he had a 7-year-old alien princess living in his cargo hold with 2 dragons that were growing bigger every single day and eating more food than Danny could afford, and Maya followed him everywhere, asking questions about everything she saw. The cargo hold had become a strange mix of a bedroom and a throne room because Maya insisted on keeping her big chair from the ship, and somehow the dragons had carried it over before the derelict vessel drifted away. And now there was this massive ornate throne sitting next to Danny's spare parts and broken equipment. Maya did not sleep much, and when she did, she had nightmares that made the whole ship shake, because apparently elf magic responded to emotions, and Danny would wake up to find pictures floating in the air around her, showing horrible things like burning cities and people screaming, and he would hold her until the images faded and she stopped crying. During the day, Maya wanted to learn everything about humans, and she asked Danny a million questions like, why do you need to eat 3 times a day when elves only eat once, and why do humans sleep so much, and why do you make those funny sounds when you wake up? And Danny tried to explain, but he was not good with kids, and most of his answers were just, I don't know, kid, that's just how we are. The dragons were a whole different problem because Ash and Ember were always hungry, and they ate everything. And Danny's food supplies were running dangerously low, and when he told Maya they needed to be careful with food, she looked at him with those big silver eyes and said, but Papa, they are growing. They need to eat, and Danny could not argue with that. He learned that Maya could do magic, but it was unpredictable because she was still young and untrained, and sometimes when she got excited, things would float around the room. And once when she laughed, really hard, the entire ship turned bright pink for an hour. And Danny had to explain to a very confused station controller why his ship looked like a child's toy. Maya told him stories about her people and how they had lived on a beautiful world with crystal, cities, and singing trees, and how they could travel between stars using magic instead of engines, and how every elf was born with a dragon companion who would stay with them for life and grow with them and protect them. She also told him about the war and how the Krell Empire had wanted elf magic for themselves, and when the elves refused to share their secrets, the Krell had declared war and hunted them down planet by planet and city by city. And Maya's voice got very small when she talked about watching her home burn from the ship while her mother used the last of her power to hide them. Danny asked why her mother had not come with her, and Maya said Mama was too hurt and she used all her magic to hide me and keep the ship safe, and she made me promise to find the other elves who escaped and bring our people together again. And then she went to sleep and did not wake up. After that, Danny did not ask about Maya's mother anymore, and he let her call him Papa, even though it made him feel like a fraud because he was not anyone's father, and he had no idea how to take care of a kid. But Maya seemed happy with him, and the dragons had stopped trying to bite him, so he figured he must be doing something right. The problem was that Danny's debts had not gone away, and the people he owed money to had found out he was still alive, and they were sending messages demanding payment and threatening to take his ship. And Danny knew he needed to make money fast, but he could not take salvage jobs anymore because he could not leave Maya alone. He tried to figure out what to do while Maya played with the dragons in the cargo hold and made them breathe fire in patterns and laughed when they got tangled up in their own wings. And Danny watched her and thought about how unfair it was that this kid had lost everything and was still able to smile. One night Maya came to the cockpit where Danny was staring at bills he could not pay, and she climbed into his lap without asking and said, "You are worried." And Danny said, "Yeah, kid, I am worried because we need money for food and fuel and I do not know how to get it." And Maya tilted her head and said, "I can help." Danny started to say no, but Maya touched his forehead like she had done when they first met, and suddenly Danny could see images in his mind of a place where elves traded magic items for supplies, and it was a hidden station that moved through space, and only people with elf blood could find it. But Maya said she could take him there. Danny asked if it was safe, and Maya said the elves who run it are good people, and they will help us because I am queen. And Danny wanted to argue that she was too young to be queen, but he could see in her eyes that she believed it with all her heart. So he said, "Okay, kid, we will try it your way." Maya gave him coordinates that changed every few seconds because the station was moving, and Danny had to fly by instinct following a feeling that Maya put in his head, and it was the strangest thing he had ever done. But after 2 days of flying through empty space, they found it. The station was called Whisper Wind, and it was beautiful and terrible at the same time because it was made of the same silver metal as Maya's ship, and it had those same symbols that hurt to look at. And when Danny docked the rusty bird, he felt magic wash over him like warm water, and it made his skin tingle. An elf woman met them at the airlock, and she had the same pointed ears and silver hair as Maya, but she was tall and old, and when she saw Maya, she dropped to her knees and said, "My queen, we thought you were lost." And tears ran down her face, and she touched her forehead to the ground. Maya looked uncomfortable with the attention and said, "Please get up, I am just Maya." And the woman stood and said, "No, child, you are our queen, and we have been searching for you." And then she saw Danny, and her eyes narrowed, and she said, "Who is this human, and why is he with you?" Maya grabbed Danny's hand and said, "This is my papa, and he saved me, and he keeps me safe." And the woman looked shocked and said, "Papa, but child, he is human." And Maya said, "I know, and I chose him, and the dragons like him. So he is my family now." The woman, whose name was Iris, looked at Danny like she was trying to see inside his soul, and Danny stood still and let her because he had nothing to hide. And finally she nodded and said, "If our queen has chosen you, then you are welcome here." And Danny let out a breath he did not know he was holding. Iris took them deeper into the station, and Danny saw other elves, and they all stopped and stared at Maya, and some of them cried, and some of them smiled, and all of them touched their foreheads in respect, and Maya tried to be brave, but Danny could feel her hand shaking in his. They reached a meeting hall where a council of elder elves waited, and they all stood when Maya entered, and one of them said, "We are ready to serve you, our queen." And Maya looked at Danny with panic in her eyes, and Danny squeezed her hand and whispered, "You can do this, kid, I believe in you." Maya took a deep breath and said, "I am young and I do not know much, but I know we need to stay together and help each other and find the others who are lost." And the elders nodded and said, "Yes, my queen, it will be done." Then Maya said, "And my papa stays with me because he is mine, and anyone who hurts him answers to me and the dragons." And the room got very quiet because apparently young elf queens did not usually make demands, but then one elder smiled and said, "As you command, our queen." Danny realized in that moment that Maya was not just a scared kid. She was also a queen, and she had power that she was just beginning to understand. And she had chosen him to stand beside her, and he had no idea if he was ready for that. But he knew he was not going to let her down. Iris arranged for supplies and food and even gave Danny enough credits to pay off some of his debts. And she said, "This is for protecting our queen." And Danny wanted to argue, but Maya said, "Papa, you have to accept it because you need it." And Danny could not argue with that logic. They stayed on Whisperwind for 3 days, and Maya met with the council and learned about the scattered elf survivors and made plans to bring them together. And Danny watched her grow more confident with every meeting, and he felt proud, even though he had no right to. On the last day before they left, Maya asked Danny if he regretted finding her, and Danny said, "No, kid, I do not regret it." And she said, "Good, because I do not regret choosing you." And then she hugged him. And Danny hugged her back and thought maybe he could learn to be the father she needed. Danny thought things were finally getting better, because Maya was happier, and the dragons were not eating quite as much, and his debts were getting smaller, and for the first time in months, he could breathe without feeling like someone was standing on his chest. But then everything went wrong on a Tuesday, which seemed like a terrible day for everything to fall apart. They had stopped at a trading station called New Hope to buy supplies and fuel, and Danny left Maya on the ship with strict instructions to stay hidden and keep the dragons quiet and lock all the doors and not open them for anyone except him. And Maya promised she would be good. And Danny believed her because she always kept her promises. The station was crowded and loud and full of people from 100 different worlds, and Danny kept his head down and moved quickly through the market buying food and medicine and parts for the rusty bird. And he was thinking about getting back to Maya when he heard someone say the word elf, and his blood went cold. He turned and saw 3 Krell soldiers standing near a weapon shop, and they were talking to a merchant and showing him a picture, and Danny could not see the picture. But he knew in his gut it was Maya, because the Krell were still hunting for her and they had tracked them somehow. Danny wanted to run back to his ship, but he forced himself to walk normally and not draw attention, and he made it halfway across the station when alarms started going off and red lights began flashing, and over the speakers a voice said, "All ships are grounded, pending security inspection." And Danny knew they had found the rusty bird. He started running then because Maya was alone and scared, and the Krell would hurt her, or worse, and Danny had promised to keep her safe, and he was not going to break that promise even if it killed him. When he reached the docking bay, there were soldiers everywhere, and they had big guns and mean faces, and his ship was surrounded, and Danny could see through the window that Maya was in the cockpit with the dragons, and she looked terrified. And that made something break inside Danny's chest. He walked up to the soldiers with his hands raised and said, "That is my ship, and you have no right to board it." And the commander turned and looked at him and smiled in a way that made Danny want to punch him and said, "We detected an illegal alien life form, and we are authorized to investigate." Danny said, "There is no one on my ship except me," and the commander said, "Then you will not mind if we search it?" And Danny said, "Actually, I do mind because I have rights." And the commander laughed and said, "Rights are for citizens, not for criminals who harbor fugitives." That was when Danny heard Maya scream, and he saw soldiers trying to cut through the airlock door, and something inside him snapped, because nobody was going to hurt his kid, and he did not care how many guns they had or how much bigger they were than him. He rushed forward and tackled the nearest soldier and got hit in the face hard enough to see stars, but he kept fighting because that was what humans did when someone threatened their family, and the soldiers were surprised because most people did not fight when they were outnumbered, but Danny was not most people. More soldiers grabbed him and held him down, and the commander said, "You just made this worse for yourself." And Danny spit blood and said, "You are not touching her." And the commander said, we will see about that. Then there was a sound like thunder, and the airlock door exploded outward and fire filled the docking bay and soldiers scattered, and Danny saw Ash and Ember come out of the ship like twin comets, and they were not the size of dogs anymore. They were huge and angry and their eyes burned red. The dragons breathed fire that melted metal and made the air shimmer with heat, and soldiers ran screaming and dropped their weapons, and Maya came out of the ship behind her dragons, and she was not crying anymore, she was angry, and her eyes glowed silver and her hair floated around her head like a crown of light. She said in a voice that echoed through the whole station, "You hurt my papa and that was a mistake," and the commander tried to raise his weapon, but Ember was faster and breathed fire that turned the gun into slag, and the commander fell backward and crawled away. Maya walked to Danny, and the soldiers holding him let go and backed away because they were smart enough to be afraid, and Maya knelt beside Danny and touched his face where it was bleeding and said, "I am sorry, Papa. I should have stayed hidden," and Danny laughed even though it hurt and said, "No, kid, you did perfect." The station security arrived then, and they had bigger guns and more soldiers, and their captain said, "Everyone stand down and surrender." And Maya stood up and said, "No, we are leaving. And if anyone tries to stop us, my dragons will burn this whole station. And I am not joking." The captain looked at the melted metal and the scared soldiers and the two massive dragons that were breathing smoke, and he said, "I believe you." And he ordered his men to lower their weapons, and Maya said, "Thank you for being smart." Danny got to his feet with Maya's help, and they walked back to the ship with the dragons following behind, and nobody tried to stop them, because everyone could see that Maya was serious about burning the station, and Danny thought his kid had grown up a lot in the past few weeks. Once they were aboard and the airlock was sealed, Danny started the engines and they launched without clearance, and no one tried to stop them, because apparently threatening to burn down a station was very effective, and Maya sat in the co-pilot seat and watched the station shrink behind them. After they were safely away, Danny looked at Maya and said, "We need to talk about what just happened," and Maya said, "I know I should not have threatened everyone, but they were hurting you and I could not let them do that." And Danny said, "I understand, kid, but you scared me." Maya looked confused and said, "Why would you be scared?" "I was protecting you," and Danny said, "I was scared because I thought they would hurt you and take you away from me. And I do not want to lose you," and Maya's eyes got wide and shiny and she said, "Really?" Danny nodded and said, "Really, kid? You are important to me and I care about what happens to you." And Maya threw her arms around his neck and said, "I care about you too, Papa." And Danny hugged her back and thought about how strange it was that he had gone from being alone to having a family in just a few weeks. But the problem was not over, because the Krell knew where they were, and they would be coming, and Danny said, "We need to leave this sector and find somewhere safe." And Maya said, "I know where we can go." And Danny said where Maya said there is a planet called Haven, where some of the elf survivors went, and it is hidden by magic, and the Krell cannot find it, and we will be safe there. And Danny said, "How far is it?" And Maya said, 3 weeks if we fly straight through. Danny did not like the idea of flying for 3 weeks with the Krell hunting them, but he did not have a better plan. So he said, "Okay, kid, we go to Haven," and Maya smiled and said, "Thank you, Papa." And then she yawned because using magic made her tired. The next few days were tense because Danny kept expecting Krell ships to appear on his scanner, but they stayed lucky and flew through empty space without seeing anyone, and Maya spent her time teaching the dragons tricks and practicing her magic and talking to Danny about everything and nothing. She told him about elf history and their beliefs and their magic and how every elf was connected to nature in ways humans could not understand. And Danny listened and learned and realized that Maya's people had been amazing, and it was a tragedy that so many of them were gone. Maya also asked Danny about human history, and she wanted to know about wars and heroes and why humans never gave up even when things were hopeless. And Danny tried to explain that humans were stubborn and too dumb to quit, and Maya said that is why Mama said humans were special. One night Maya could not sleep, and she came to the cockpit where Danny was flying through the dark, and she said, "Papa, can I ask you something?" And Danny said, "Of course, kid, ask me anything." And Maya said, "Do you think Mama would be proud of me?" Danny looked at this small, brave girl who had lost everything and was still fighting to save her people, and he said, "Kid, I think your Mama would be so proud of you. She would burst." And Maya smiled and said, I hope so, because I am trying really hard. Danny said, I can see that. And, you are doing great, and Maya said, even when I get scared, and Danny said, especially when you get scared, because being brave does not mean you are not afraid. It means you do the right thing. Even when you are afraid. Maya thought about that and nodded and said, you are brave too, Papa, because you fight even when you are scared. And Danny laughed and said, Kid, I am scared all the time, but I keep going because you need me. And Maya said, I do need you. Papa and Danny felt his heart get bigger. 2 weeks into the journey, they picked up a distress signal, and Maya said we should help them, and Danny said, Kid, we cannot afford to stop. We need to get to Haven. And Maya said, but someone needs help. And Danny looked at her face and knew he had already lost this argument. They changed course and found a small transport ship that was damaged and drifting, and Danny docked with them and went aboard and found a family of refugees who were fleeing from the Krell, and they had children, and they were scared and hungry. Danny brought them back to the Rusty Bird and gave them food and water, and Maya used her magic to heal their injuries, and the family cried and thanked them and said they had prayed for help, and the gods had sent them an angel. Maya blushed and said, I am not an angel, I am just Maya. And the mother said, you are an angel to us. And Maya looked at Danny, and Danny smiled because he was proud of his kid for wanting to help people even when it was dangerous. 3 weeks of flying through space had changed things between Danny and Maya, because they had fallen into routines like a real family. And Maya woke him up every morning by jumping on his bunk and yelling, Papa, time to wake up. And Danny would groan and say, 5 more minutes, kid. And Maya would laugh and the dragons would roar and Danny would give up and get out of bed. They had breakfast together every day, and Maya had learned to like human food, especially pancakes, which Danny made from a mix that probably expired years ago. But Maya said they were the best things she ever tasted, and Danny did not have the heart to tell her they were terrible. During the days, Maya practiced her magic, and the dragons practiced flying in the cargo hold, which was barely big enough for them anymore, because they kept growing and sometimes they crashed into things and broke them, and Danny would sigh and add it to the list of repairs he needed to make. Maya also made Danny teach her about human things like music and movies and games, and she loved old Earth songs, especially the ones about home and family, and she would sing along even though she did not know all the words, and Danny thought it was the cutest thing he had ever seen. At night, they would sit in the cockpit and watch the stars go by, and Maya would tell stories about the great elf heroes, and Danny would tell stories about human explorers, and they would talk about everything and nothing. And Danny realized he had not been this happy in years, but the closer they got to Haven, the more nervous Maya became because she was worried the other elves would not accept her as queen because she was so young, and she had a human for a father. And Danny told her that anyone who could not see how special she was an idiot, and Maya giggled and said, Papa, you should not call people idiots. On the last day of the journey, Maya came to Danny and said, Papa, I need to tell you something, and she looked serious, so Danny stopped what he was doing and gave her his full attention and said, What is it? Kid, Maya said, when we get to Haven, the council will want to test me to make sure I am really the queen, and part of the test is that I have to prove I can lead by showing I have someone who believes in me completely and will stand with me no matter what, and I want that person to be you. Danny felt his throat get tight and said, Kid, I am just a salvage runner. I am not anyone important. And Maya said, You are important to me, and that is what matters. And Danny said, Okay, kid, if you want me there, then I will be there. Maya hugged him tight and said, Thank you, Papa. I could not do this without you. And Danny hugged her back and thought about how this little girl had changed his entire life and made him want to be a better person. They reached the coordinates Maya had been given, and at first there was nothing there, just empty space. But then Maya closed her eyes and started humming, and the dragons hummed with her, and suddenly the air in front of them rippled like water and a planet appeared out of nowhere. It was the most beautiful thing Danny had ever seen, because the whole planet glowed with soft golden light, and there were forests and mountains and oceans that sparkled like they were made of diamonds, and floating above the planet were structures that looked like they were made of crystal and light. Maya said, Welcome to Haven, Papa. And Danny said, Kid, this is amazing. And Maya smiled and said, Wait until You see the cities, and Danny thought if the cities were more impressive than this, he might pass out. They got clearance to land and descended through the atmosphere, and Danny saw that the forests below were full of trees that were taller than skyscrapers, and their leaves were silver and gold, and they seemed to sing as the wind moved through them. The landing pad was in the middle of a city that was built into the trees themselves, and buildings grew out of massive trunks and bridges made of living. Vines connected everything, and there were elves everywhere, and they all stopped and stared as the rusty bird landed, because it was ugly and dirty and completely out of place. Maya took a deep breath and said, "I am ready." And Danny said, "You sure, kid?" And Maya nodded and said, "Yes, because you are with me," and Danny thought no pressure, right? They opened the airlock and stepped out, and waiting for them was a group of elves in fancy robes. And they all looked very serious and important, and one of them stepped forward and said, "I am Elder Theron, and we have been expecting you." Princess Maya stood up straight and said, "I am Queen Maya, and this is my father, Danny Cole, and these are my dragon companions, Ash and Ember." And Elder Theron's eyes widened, and he said, "Your father." "But child, he is human." Maya said, "I know, and I chose him, and he has protected me and kept me safe and taught me to be brave." And Elder Theron looked at Danny like he was something stuck to his shoe and said, "A human cannot be the father of an elf queen. This is unprecedented." Danny felt his temper rise, but before he could say anything, Maya's eyes started glowing, and she said, "My mama died protecting me, and Danny found me and saved me, and he is my papa now. And if you cannot accept that, then I will leave and find another place for my people." The other elders started whispering, and Elder Theron looked shocked and said, "My queen, please calm down. We did not mean to offend. We are simply concerned about tradition." And Maya said, "Traditions change, and my papa stays with me." An older elf woman stepped forward, and she had kind eyes, and she smiled at Maya and said, "I am Elder Sienna, and I think we got off on the wrong foot." And she looked at Danny and said, "Thank you for protecting our queen." And Danny nodded and said, "She is my kid, and I would do anything for her." Elder Sienna said, "We can see that." And she turned to the other elders and said, "This human has done what none of us could do, and he has kept our queen alive and safe, and that should be honored, not questioned." And some of the elders nodded. But Elder Theron still looked unhappy. Maya was taken to a building that looked like a palace, and Danny followed with the dragons, and they were given rooms that were bigger than his entire ship and had windows that looked out over the forest, and Maya ran around touching everything and saying, "Papa, look at this, and Papa, look at that." That night there was a feast in Maya's honor, and Danny felt completely out of place in his worn clothes, surrounded by elves in beautiful robes. But Maya held his hand and introduced him to everyone as "My Papa Danny," and no one dared to question her. The next morning was the test, and Maya was nervous, and she kept asking Danny if he thought she would pass, and Danny said, "Kid, you are the bravest, smartest, most amazing person I know, and you are going to do great." And Maya said, "You have to say that because you are my papa." And Danny said, "No, I say it because it is true." The test was held in a great hall, and all the elves on Haven came to watch, and Maya had to stand in the center of a circle carved into the floor and answer questions from the elders and prove she could use magic and show she understood elf history. And Maya did amazing, and she answered every question, and her magic was strong and beautiful, and she made plants grow and water dance and light fill the room, and everyone watched in awe, and Danny felt so proud he thought his chest would explode. Then came the final part of the test, and Elder Theron said, "A queen must have someone who believes in her completely and will stand with her through anything." And Maya said, "I do." And she turned and looked at Danny and said, "My papa believes in me, Elder." Theron said, "Let him prove it." And he made Danny stand in the circle with Maya. And then he used magic to show Danny's memories. And everyone could see Danny finding Maya, and protecting her and fighting for her, and choosing to keep her safe, even when it was dangerous. The memories showed Danny teaching Maya to make pancakes and telling her stories and holding her when she had nightmares, and the way he looked at her with love and pride. And all the elves watched in silence, and some of them started crying. When the memories ended, Elder Sienna said, "This human loves our queen as if she were his own blood, and he has proven himself worthy." And all the elves except Elder Theron nodded and said, "We accept him." Elder Theron said, "But he is human." And Elder Sienna said, And that makes his love even more remarkable because he gains nothing from this except the joy of being her father, and Elder Theron had no answer to that. Maya was declared the rightful queen, and a crown was placed on her head, and it was sized for her this time and fit perfectly. And she stood in front of all her people and said, "I promise to lead with courage and kindness, and to never forget that we are strongest when we help each other." The elves cheered, and Maya looked at Danny and Danny smiled back and thought about how he had just wanted scrap metal, and instead found a daughter and a purpose in a family. That night Maya came to Danny's room and said, "Papa, I was so scared, but you believed in me and that made me brave." And Danny said, "Kid, you were already brave, you just needed to believe in yourself." And Maya said, "I believe in myself because you believe in me." She climbed into his lap like she always did and said, "Papa, can I ask you something important?" And Danny said, "Always, kid." And Maya said, "Will you stay with me forever because I do not want to lose you?" And Danny felt tears in his eyes and said, "Kid, I am not going anywhere, I promise." Maya hugged him tight and said, "I love you, Papa." And Danny said, "I love you too, kid," and he meant it with his whole heart. Life on Haven was good for the first 2 months, and Maya was learning to be a queen, and Danny was learning to be a father. And the dragons were getting so big they had to live in a special grove outside the city because they did not fit in buildings anymore. And Maya visited them every day, and Danny came with her because that was what fathers did. Maya had lessons with the elders every morning, and she learned about diplomacy and leadership and ancient magic, and she was good at all of it. And Danny would watch from the back of the room and feel proud. And sometimes Maya would look at him and smile, and he would give her a thumbs up. In the afternoons, Maya would practice combat magic with the warriors, because even though she was queen, she needed to know how to defend herself, and Danny insisted on that, because he had seen what the Krell could do, and he wanted Maya to be ready for anything. Danny had his own routine, and he helped repair ships and taught the elf mechanics about human engineering, and they were fascinated by how humans built things to last through damage and abuse instead of making them beautiful and perfect. And Danny said that was because humans expected things to break. He also trained with the elf warriors, because he wanted to be able to protect Maya better. And at first they laughed at the human who wanted to fight, but then they sparred with him and realized he was tough and stubborn, and did not quit, even when he was losing, and they started to respect him. Maya made friends with other young elves, and she would play with them in the forest, and Danny would watch from a distance and make sure she was safe. And sometimes she would run over and say, "Papa, come play with us," and Danny would say, "Kid, I am too old for games," and Maya would say, "No, you are not," and drag him into whatever they were doing. Everything was peaceful until the day the alarms went off, and everyone was told to get to shelter because ships were approaching, and they were Krell warships, and there were a lot of them, and Danny grabbed Maya and ran to the command center, where Elder Sienna and the other leaders were gathering. Elder Sienna said they found us somehow, and they have enough ships to destroy the whole planet, and we need to evacuate, but there is not enough time. And Maya said, "How long do we have?" And Elder Sienna said maybe an hour before they are in weapon range. Maya looked at Danny and said, "Papa, what do we do?" And Danny said, "Kid, I need you to trust me." And Maya said, "Always." And Danny turned to Elder Sienna and said, "I have an idea, but it is crazy." And Elder Sienna said, "Tell me." Danny said, "The Krell want Maya and they want elf magic, and what if we give them what they want?" And everyone started yelling and saying no, but Danny said, "Listen, let me finish," and he explained his plan, and it was risky and stupid and probably would not work. But it was the only chance they had. The plan was simple and terrible, and Maya would go out to meet the Krell fleet in a small ship and pretend to surrender. And while they were focused on capturing her, the elf warriors would attack from behind and destroy their command ship, and without their leader, the Krell would fall apart. Elder Theron said, "Absolutely not. We cannot risk the queen." And Maya said, "Yes, we can, because I am not just a queen. I am also a warrior, and this is my duty." And Danny wanted to argue, but he saw the look in Maya's eyes and knew she had made up her mind. Elder Sienna said, "If we do this, the queen needs protection." And Danny said, "I will go with her." And Elder Theron said, "You are human. You will be useless against the Krell." And Danny said, "Watch me." And his voice was cold and dangerous. And even Elder Theron backed down, prepared quickly, and Maya put on armor that was made of silver metal that flowed like water. And Danny wore a combat suit that the elves had given him, and he carried weapons that he barely knew how to use, but he would figure it out because Maya needed him. Ash and Ember wanted to come, but Maya said no. You have to stay here and protect the city if the plan fails, and the dragons roared in protest. But Maya touched their heads and said, please do this for me. And they bowed to her will because she was their bonded companion. The small ship they took was fast and elegant, and Maya flew it herself because she was actually a better pilot than Danny, even though she was 7 years old, and Danny sat in the co-pilot seat and checked his weapons, and tried not to think about all the ways this could go wrong. They flew out to meet the Krell fleet, and it was massive, and there were dozens of warships all bristling with weapons, and in the center was a command ship that was 3 times bigger than the others, and Maya sent a message saying she was Queen Maya, and she wanted to negotiate. The Krell commander responded, and his face appeared on the screen, and he was ugly and mean-looking and covered in scars. And he said, you will surrender yourself and all elf magic to the Krell Empire, or we will destroy your planet and kill everyone you love. Maya said, I will come aboard your ship to discuss terms, but my guardian comes with me. And the commander laughed and said, one human will not make a difference, bring him if you wish, and the transmission ended. And Danny said, kid, I do not like this, and Maya said, me neither, Papa, but we have to try. They docked with the Krell command ship and were escorted to the bridge by soldiers who had guns pointed at them the whole time, and the commander sat on a throne and looked at Maya like she was a prize he had won, and said, you are smaller than I expected. Maya said, I am small, but I am still queen. And the commander said, not for much longer, and he ordered his soldiers to take her, and Danny moved to protect her. But there were too many guns, and he could not fight them all. Then Maya started singing, and it was the song she had sung when they first escaped the pirates, and Danny felt power wash over him. And suddenly he was faster and stronger, and his skin was harder, and Maya had used magic to make him into a weapon. He moved like lightning and disarmed the nearest soldier and used that gun to shoot 3 more, and the Krell were shouting and firing, but the bullets bounced off him, and Danny fought his way to Maya and stood in front of her and said, you want her? You go through me. The commander was angry now, and he stood up and pulled out a sword that crackled with energy and said, I will kill you myself, human. And he charged at Danny, and they fought, and it was brutal and fast, and Danny had never fought someone this strong before. But Maya was still singing, and Danny could feel her magic flowing through him and giving him strength, and he blocked the commander's strikes and found openings and landed hits that would have killed a normal person. But the commander was enhanced too, and kept coming. Outside the ship the elf warriors were attacking, and they had cloaked their ships with magic, and the Krell did not see them until it was too late. And explosions rocked the command ship, and alarms started going off, and the commander looked around in rage and said, what have you done? Maya stopped singing and said, I have done what I had to do to protect my people. And the commander roared and tried to strike her. But Danny intercepted the blow and grabbed the commander's arm and said, you made a mistake, and Danny broke the commander's arm. The commander screamed and fell, and his soldiers did not know what to do, because their leader was beaten and their ship was falling apart around them. And Maya said, you have one chance to retreat or die. And Danny said, I vote for die. But Maya glared at him and said, Papa, we offer mercy. The Krell soldiers looked at each other and then at their commander, who was on the ground holding his broken arm, and one of them said, we will retreat. And they ran to their ships and fled. And the rest of the Krell fleet saw their command ship was destroyed, and their commander was defeated, and they scattered. Maya and Danny escaped in their ship just before the command ship exploded, and they flew back to Haven. And when they landed, everyone was cheering and crying and celebrating, because they had won, and they were safe. Elder Sienna said, you saved us all, and Maya said, it was not just me, it was Papa too, and Danny felt embarrassed but proud, and all the elves looked at him with respect now because he had fought for them and proved that humans could be brave and strong. That night there was a huge celebration, and Maya was tired but happy, and she sat with Danny away from the crowd and said, Papa, that was scary. And Danny said, yeah, kid, it was scary for me too. And Maya said, but we did it together. And Danny said, yes. We did. Maya leaned against him and said, Papa, I have been thinking. And Danny said about what kid, and Maya said about how you are the best thing that ever happened to me. And Danny felt his heart get full and said, kid, you are the best thing that ever happened to me, too. She looked up at him and said, I know I am supposed to be queen and lead my people and do important things, but the most important thing to me is that you are my papa. And I love you, and Danny said I love you too, kid. More than anything. The next morning, Elder Sienna came to see them, and she said there is news, and Maya said what kind of news? And Elder Sienna said we have been contacted by other elf survivors, and they want to come to Haven, and they want to meet their queen. Maya looked nervous and said how many? And Elder Sienna said thousands, and they are coming from all over the galaxy, and they heard what you did and they believe in you. And Maya said, Papa, I do not. I know if I can do this. Danny knelt down so he was eye level with her and said, Kid, you just defeated a Krell fleet and saved an entire planet, and you can definitely handle meeting your people. And Maya said, but what if they do not like me? And Danny said, then they are idiots and you do not need them, but they will love you because you are amazing. Over the next few weeks, ships arrived constantly, and Haven became crowded with elves who had been